Welcome back after the break. You're watching Indus News live from Lahore, and I'm Fiza Jamal bringing you detailed stories. We start from Syria, where at least 35 people have been killed in fresh fighting between rebels and government forces in northwest of the country. War Monitor said Russian airstrikes and clashes killed 26 pro-government security personnel and 9 militants. Earlier, the airstrikes have killed at least 28 people in northwestern Idlib and Hama provinces. The attack happened despite a ceasefire announced by Moscow. The Idlib region is supposed to be protected from regime offensives by a buffer zone deal signed by Russia and Turkey. The region has come under heavy attack since Al-Qaeda-affiliated militants took control there in January. War monitors say over 360 civilians have been killed since late April. The United Nations says the fighting displaced nearly 300,000 in May alone. In Tajikistan, Iran's nuclear program and Jerusalem have figured prominently at a meeting of Central Asian powers in Dushanbe. President Hassan Rouhani again warned that Iran could continue to reduce compliance with its 2015 nuclear deal commitments. He said Tehran's position would only change if other signatories showed positive signals. Speaking on the Palestine issue, President Tayyip Erdogan said Turkey rejects that the issue of Israel declaring Jerusalem as its capital is a done deal. The leaders have gathered in Tajikistan for the 5th summit of the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia. Currently, CICA has 27 permanent state members. Hong Kong has suspended a controversial new extradition law after widespread protests. The proposed law would have allowed people to be extradited to mainland China to stand trial. Chief Executive Carrie Lam conceded the bill had caused divisions in society. More than 1 million people marched against the proposed law on Sunday and Wednesday. Demonstrators were met with tear gas and rubber bullets from the police, plunging the city into turmoil. Lam said she would hold consultations with various parties before deciding what next to do with the bill.
In other words, the Council will halt its work in relation to the bill until our work in communication, explanation, and listening to opinions is completed. We have no intention to set a deadline for this work.
For more on this development, we are joined by our Beijing correspondent, Patrick Falk. Thank you, Patrick, for giving us your time. So firstly, it is rare for the Hong Kong government to back down because of popular pressure. Did it back down to stop the opposition to the extradition law morphing into a wider political movement?
I think you're right to say that certainly in recent years it's been increasingly rare for the government to back down on any issue at all. But of course what's been happening here in Hong Kong has been compared so many times to what happened in 2003 when the government tried to introduce Article 23, and that prompted 500,000 people, 500,000 people to turn out and protest against the government, and the government had to eventually shelve the plans then. But I think it's interesting the point you make about the government not wanting this to turn into some sort of wider movement. I think that certainly will have been on their minds when they made the decision to delay or suspend the bill for the time being. Because if you look back to 2014, after the umbrella protests, I think it's fair to say that the pro-democracy camp had become somewhat disenfranchised. But here we are again, and they have been galvanized by this issue, and they've drawn support not just from people who support the opposition camp, but also from people with slightly different political leanings. And it's going to be very interesting to see how they capitalize on this movement right now.
Right, and you know that the protests coincided with rising tensions with this over trade, 5G and Taiwan. Do you think the timing of the protests is also a factor in the Hong Kong government's decision?
Well, that's part of why all of this has backfired so spectacularly for the government. As we know, in the last few days, there's been increasing talk from the US about reviewing its relationship with Hong Kong. And of course, on Thursday, lawmakers in the US proposed a bill that would require the Secretary of State to review the Hong Kong Policy Act, under which Hong Kong enjoys a special trade and economic status with the US. And this is something that's been a massive concern for Hong Kong. And as we know, this is not just about curtailing Hong Kong's freedoms and the extradition bill itself, but also very much about Hong Kong's status as an international business hub. So that is something that the government will have had to reflect upon as well, because Hong Kong has inevitably become a chess piece, if you like, in this ongoing trade war between the US and China. And on the question of Taiwan, there are many Taiwanese reporters here in Hong Kong covering this story and watching it very closely indeed. There are elections coming up just around the corner for Taiwan, and the incumbent president Tsai Ing-wen has said, following that massive march on Monday, that look, one country, two systems simply wouldn't work for Taiwan, and there is a complete breakdown in rule of law there. So this is working in favor for her and the DPP, and against the Kuomintang, which favors closer relations with China.
Right, Patrick. And lastly, how has the Chinese central government responded to these developments?
Well, the central government's been very careful with what it said. It's said earlier in the week that it supports the Hong Kong government's stance, but it hasn't really sort of got involved with the actual passage of bill, and it doesn't want to be accused of influencing what's going on here, and perhaps being accused of forcing the local government to push this bill through. But they will have been watching very closely the developments in Hong Kong. They'll be concerned about what they've called riots taking place here, and many people in China are very curious. As you know, I've come down from Beijing to report on this story, and a lot of people are asking about it. But of course, there's been a media clampdown on what's happening in Hong Kong. The central government certainly won't want anything like this to inspire people in mainland China to protest.
Thank you, Patrick, for your time and providing insight into this crucial developing story. We'll definitely keep our eyes on it and update you. Now we move on to Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition has targeted Houthi rebel positions, including air defenses in the capital, Sana'a. It comes a day after Saudi Arabia's air forces intercepted 5 Houthi drones launched at Abha airport. The Saudi-led coalition earlier pledged to respond to a week of rebel drone strikes. The region's conflict escalated following the Houthi missile attack on the kingdom's southwest, which wounded 26 people. In Kyrgyzstan, Prime Minister Imran Khan has met Russia's President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. Pakistan's Foreign Office says they discussed the Afghanistan conflict, the Middle East and Kashmir. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi says the Prime Minister also spoke to his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi. Qureshi says Pakistan has extended an olive branch, but it appears India does not want to leave its election mindset. He says India has to decide whether it wants bilateral talks with Pakistan to end any outstanding issues. Pakistan has signed 3 agreements to promote education, health and cultural activities during the heads of states meetings. Meanwhile, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi has criticized trade protectionism and unilateralism at the SCO summit. Modi called for an inclusive multilateral trading system under World Trade Organization rules. Indian media reports New Delhi may impose retaliatory import duties on 29 US products. Washington withdrew duty-free access to US markets for Indian exports on June the 5th. The escalation of trade tensions comes ahead of US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's visit to India on June the 24th. At the SCO summit in Kyrgyzstan, Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has called the United States a serious threat to global stability. President Rouhani says the US is violating all international rules by using its economic and military resources. Iran dismissed US accusations over the recent attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump says he is ready to hold talks with Iran. In an interview, President Trump dismissed previous threats by Tehran it could block the Straits of Hormuz in a conflict. Trump says he wants Iran back at the table but is in no rush. U.S. Defense Secretary Patrick Shanahan said the U.S. will build international consensus to the Middle East problem. He said National Security Advisor John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have been given the goal to make contingency plans.
When you look at the situation that a Norwegian ship, Japanese ship, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, 15% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. So we obviously need to make contingency plans should the situation deteriorate. But we also need to broaden our support for this international situation.
Well, it's time for us to take a short break. Don't go anywhere because more stories are to follow. Welcome back. After the break, we'll move on to our next story. The main suspect in the Sri Lanka's Easter bombings has been sent back to Sri Lanka after being detained by Interpol in Saudi Arabia. Sri Lankan officials say Saudi authorities arrested 5 Sri Lankans suspected of involvement in the attacks and sent them to Colombo. More than 250 people were killed in the attacks on churches and hotels on Easter Sunday. 9 suicide bombers targeted 3 churches and 3 luxury hotels. Afterwards, communal tensions on the island pitted Sri Lanka's Buddhists and Christians against the Muslim minority. The authorities arrested 2,000 people after the attacks. 634 are still in custody. Moldova's Maia Sandu has been sworn in as the new prime minister after the resignation of her predecessor, Pavel Filip. Sandu took office last weekend as the head of a new coalition government. Pavel Filip stepped down on Friday but demanded a snap election, but he refused to recognize Prime Minister Maia Sandu's government as legal. The Russians support the new government, and Sandu is the country's 8th prime minister since 2013. The EU, which froze aid to Moldova last year, said it was ready to work with the democratically legitimate government.
I have a message to the entire world. Moldova is finally free. And we would like to thank everybody who helped us in these difficult times.
The International Court of Justice has rejected the United Arab Emirates' petition for special measures against Qatar. The Emiratis had asked to stop Qatar blocking access to an Emirati website allowing Qataris expelled from the UAE to obtain permits to return. The court ruled in favor of Qatar by 15-1. Qatar has faced an economic and diplomatic boycott since June 2017 by Gulf rivals who accused Doha of being close to Iran. Flash floods in China have killed 61 people. Thousands are still stranded, while nearly 1.5 million people have been affected. The floods followed torrential rains in central and southern parts of the country. Officials say the floods have destroyed nearly 11,000 hectares of crops in Jiangxi province. Rescue authorities say over 350,000 people have been evacuated from the affected areas. 1,300 houses have also been destroyed. The rains have hit the economy with $380 million of losses. As heavy rains still sweep the country, meteorologists are warning of an increased risk of landslides and flooding. Clashes between the Libyan government and forces loyal to Khalifa Haftar are intensifying. The UN-recognized military says they have destroyed a tank belonging to Haftar's army. Haftar's warplanes have attacked government lines in Mashu al-Moz and Ain Zera, south of Tripoli. Pro-Haftar forces say they shot down a government fighter jet. In response, the government says it destroyed some Eastern Forces tanks. Neither side has confirmed its rivals' claims. Turkey has warned it will take reciprocal steps if the United States imposes sanctions over its purchase of the Russian S-400 missile system. Foreign Minister Mevlut Çavuşoğlu said in an interview, Turkey is determined to buy the S-400 regardless of the outcome. Tensions between the US and Turkey have risen in recent months over Ankara's purchasing the missile defense system. Çavuşoğlu also says Turkey will not accept any excuse from Russia on its ceasefire violations in Syria's Idlib region. Turkey and Russia had agreed in September 2018 to turn Idlib into a de-escalation zone. Wide-ranging conspiracy theories have fueled the outbreak of polio in war-torn Afghanistan. People's lack of trust has made the vaccination program difficult to enforce. Details in this report.
Afghanistan is one of only 3 countries in the world where polio remains endemic. A total ban on inoculations by the Taliban has resulted in 7 new polio cases in areas controlled by them. The health ministry says that the ban will deprive more than 2 million children of the vaccination.
Sometimes we have to go to the houses several times and insist on vaccination. That is when they get us wrong and tell us if it was a beneficial thing, you won't keep coming and bothering us.
The Taliban's ban on the polio immunization program has instilled fears among people. Families refuse to have their children vaccinated, putting them at risk of contracting the potentially fatal disease.
She got fever, I couldn't move her legs anymore. When we took her to the hospital, she was admitted for 7 days, and then we knew what has happened to her.
Past decades saw a decline in polio cases in Afghanistan, but last year saw a jump with 21 new cases. The health ministry says raising public awareness among vulnerable communities is key to debunking myths.
In Brazil, a nationwide strike by trade unions against the government's planned pension reforms has disrupted public transport. Teachers and students are also preparing to take to the streets over planned cuts to education spending. More in this report.
President Bolsonaro's proposed overhaul of the pension system is seen as key to getting a series of economic reforms through Congress. He has warned that Brazil will go bankrupt if his plan is not approved. But the changes to the retirement age and contributions have faced resistance from trade unions. Brazilians have shown mixed reactions to the strike.
I am against the strike because it paralyzes the whole city. It is detrimental to commercial enterprises. The city stops. When there is a strike in Sao Paulo, everything stops. It's good. It's a demand to improve people's situation because the people in power, they just rob us and we only have the crumbs left.
A pared-back draft of the reform presented to Congress did little to appease union leaders who vowed to go ahead with the shutdown. It reduces expected savings from 1.2 trillion reais in 10 years to around 900 billion reais. Such savings are seen as vital to repairing Brazil's finances and economy, which were devastated by a crisis in 2015 and 2016.
In the world of business, Mexico says it is ready to retaliate if the U.S. imposes tariffs on its exports. U.S. President Donald Trump has warned Mexico of tariffs hike if it fails to restrict irregular immigration from Central America. Economy Minister Graciela Marquez said his country will take all necessary steps to defend its trade interests. This comes as Mexico's Senate has approved a draft law that would ratify the trade deal with the US and Canada. The new agreement between the 3 countries will replace the North America Free Trade Agreement. Meanwhile, Mexico has deported 76 Cubans as a part of crackdown on immigrants trying to reach the US. Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard said He will urge the Group of 20 summit this month to pay attention to the issue. And now we'll give you a quick look at the weather around the globe. These are all the stories in detail we have for you this hour. Stay tuned to Indus News for further updates.